I was 26 years old, a third-year associate at Morrison & Wells, when senior partner Diana Hartwick deliberately buried the evidence that would have won my first major case, then blamed the loss on my incompetence in front of the entire litigation department. I had no idea that she'd stolen my research, filed it under her own name in a different case, and told the managing partners I'd missed critical deadlines due to carelessness. I walked out of that firm with my reputation in ruins, my confidence shattered, and my dream of becoming a trial attorney seemingly destroyed forever. Before we dive into this incredible story, I'd love to know, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. I always love seeing our global community come together. If you enjoy stories about justice, redemption, and how integrity ultimately prevails over corruption, make sure to hit that like button right now and subscribe to our channel so you never miss these inspiring true stories. Now, let me take you back to that devastating afternoon 12 years ago when I was just another young lawyer who believed that hard work and honesty were enough to succeed in a world where neither mattered as much as I thought they did. The conference room on the 42nd floor of Morrison & Wells had floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked downtown Chicago, and I remember standing there at 6 in the morning, watching the sunrise paint the buildings gold, thinking this was the day everything would change for me. I'd spent 3 months preparing for the Donovan pharmaceutical case, 3 months of 18-hour days, of takeout containers stacked on my desk, of research that went so deep into product liability law that I dreamed in case citations. The evidence I'd uncovered was irrefutable. Internal emails showing Donovan executives knew about the drug's side effects years before the FDA warnings. Testing data they deliberately suppressed. A paper trail so clear that even a first-year law student could follow it to a guilty verdict. I'd organized everything into a presentation that would blow the senior partners away. This wasn't just about winning the case. This was about proving that I belonged at Morrison & Wells, that the girl who'd grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment in Pilsen, whose mother cleaned offices to pay for her community college classes, who'd worked her way through law school waiting tables and tutoring, deserved to sit at the same table as the Ivy League graduates with their trust funds and their connections. I'd laid out my findings in a detailed memo, cross-referenced every document, prepared exhibits that would make the case impossible to lose. My supervising partner, Richard Morrison himself, had told me to present my research at the morning meeting. He'd actually smiled at me, this man who never smiled, and said I'd done exceptional work. Diana Hartwick arrived at 7:30, an hour before the meeting. I was so excited to show her what I'd found that I didn't notice the way her eyes narrowed when she saw the thickness of my binders, the meticulous organization of my files. She was 43 then, beautiful in that sharp, expensive way that came from personal trainers and dermatologists, and a wardrobe that cost more than my annual salary. She'd made partner at 35, the youngest woman in the firm's history, and everyone whispered about how brilliant she was. How ruthless, how she never lost. I admired her. God help me, I actually admired her. She asked to review my materials before the meeting, said she wanted to make sure everything was presentation ready. I handed them over gratefully, relieved to have her guidance. She was my mentor after all. She'd been assigned to oversee my development, to help me navigate the politics of big law. I watched her flip through my research, saw her pause at certain pages, saw something flicker across her face that I couldn't quite read. She told me the presentation looked good, but suggested I grab coffee before the meeting, said I looked exhausted and needed to be sharp. I remember her exact words because I've replayed them 1,000 times since. Go take care of yourself, Emma. You've earned a break. I'll make sure everything's ready for the meeting. I went to the Starbucks 3 blocks away, spent 20 minutes in line, treated myself to an overpriced latte because I felt like celebrating. When I got back to the conference room at 8:50, 10 minutes before the meeting, my files were exactly where I'd left them. Diana was on her phone, looking perfectly composed. The senior partners started filing in at 9. Richard Morrison, Thomas Wells, Catherine Jang, David Brennan. The people who decided which associates made partner and which ones were quietly encouraged to seek opportunities elsewhere. I smoothed down my suit jacket, the nicest one I owned, bought on sale at Macy's specifically for this presentation. My hands were shaking slightly as I opened my binder. The first page was wrong. Not wrong, exactly. Just not what I'd written. The formatting was different. I flipped to the next page, my heart starting to pound. The research was there, but the organization had changed. Citations were in different orders. My carefully constructed arguments had been rearranged. I looked up at Diana, confused, and she was watching me with an expression I couldn't decipher. Richard Morrison cleared his throat, asked me to begin. I started to explain my findings, but every time I referenced a page number, the information wasn't where I expected it to be. I fumbled, apologized, tried to find the right sections. The senior partners exchanged glances. Catherine Jang checked her watch. Then Diana spoke up, her voice full of concern. "Emma, are you feeling all right? You seem disorganized this morning." I assured her I was fine, that something was just off with my materials. I pushed through the presentation, but I could feel it falling apart. Without my careful structure, the evidence seemed scattered, less compelling. I sounded uncertain because I was uncertain, constantly searching for documents that should have been exactly where I'd placed them. The meeting that should have taken 30 minutes stretched to an hour as I struggled to make my case coherent. When I finally finished, there was silence. Then Richard Morrison said, in that quiet, disappointed voice that was somehow worse than yelling, "This is what you spent 3 months on?" I tried to explain that something had happened to my files, that this wasn't how I'd organized the research. Diana jumped in again, still sounding concerned, still seeming like she was trying to help me. I looked over Emma's materials this morning, and I did notice they seemed a bit scattered. I thought maybe she was just nervous about the presentation. "Emma, did you have someone else review this before today?" I said no, that I'd done all the research myself. Diana nodded slowly, like she was considering something troubling. That might be part of the problem. This case is extremely complex. Perhaps it was too much for a third-year associate to handle alone. The meeting ended badly. Richard Morrison told me to clean up my research and resubmit it. The other partners filed out, and I could see the doubt in their faces. I'd wasted their time. I'd presented sloppy work. I'd proven that I wasn't ready for major cases. Diana stayed behind, put her hand on my shoulder in what looked like sympathy. "Don't be too hard on yourself, Emma. We all have off days. Why don't you take the afternoon to reorganize everything, and we'll try again next week?" I nodded, too shocked to speak, and she left me alone in that conference room with my ruined presentation and my shattered confidence. I spent the rest of the day going through my files, trying to understand what had happened. It wasn't until evening when that I logged into the firm's document management system and saw it. My research memo, the one I'd spent weeks writing, had been filed under Diana Hartwick's name in the Brennan pharmaceutical case. A different matter entirely, but similar enough that my work would be valuable. The timestamp showed it had been uploaded at 7:45 that morning, 15 minutes after Diana arrived, while I was still in the conference room showing her my materials. She'd taken my work, my research, my carefully documented evidence, and claimed it as her own for a case that would make her millions in billing. I sat there staring at my computer screen, my whole body going cold. I checked the file properties, the metadata, everything that would prove I'd written that memo. But Diana had been smart. She'd retyped everything, changed just enough that it wouldn't be an exact match to my original. She'd kept all my research, all my analysis, all my brilliant connections between the evidence and the law, but she'd made it look like her own work. I pulled up my original files from my personal folder, the ones I'd saved to the firm's server with my name on them. They were gone, deleted. The only copies that existed were the ones on my laptop, And who would believe a third-year associate over a senior partner? I could have gone to Richard Morrison. I could have shown him the files on my laptop, explained what Diana had done. But I was 26 years old, exhausted, and I'd just humiliated myself in front of the entire leadership team. Who would they believe? The youngest female partner in firm history? The woman who brought in millions in business? Or the girl from Pilsen who'd just proven she couldn't handle a major case? I knew how these things worked. I'd seen other associates try to challenge partners. They were always the ones who ended up leaving. The Donovan case went to trial 3 weeks later with a different associate handling it, someone from Harvard whose father was a federal judge. We lost. The jury found for Donovan Pharmaceuticals, and our client got nothing. I wasn't surprised. Without the evidence I'd uncovered, without the paper trail I'd meticulously documented, the case was weak. The associate who'd taken over had done competent work, but he hadn't dug as deep as I had. He hadn't found the smoking gun emails, the suppressed testing data, the internal memos that proved corporate knowledge of the dangers. All of that was sitting in Diana Hartwick's files for the Brennan case, which she won spectacularly 6 months later, securing a settlement of $47 million and cementing her reputation as one of the best pharmaceutical litigators in the country. But before that victory, before Diana got to bask in the glory of work I'd done, she had to make sure I couldn't cause problems. 2 days after the disastrous presentation, Richard Morrison called me into his office. He looked uncomfortable, like he was about to do something he didn't want to do, but felt was necessary. He told me there had been concerns about my work quality, about my attention to detail, about whether I was really Morrison and Wells material. He mentioned the Donovan presentation specifically, how I'd seemed unprepared despite having months to work on it. He said the firm had decided not to renew my associate contract for the following year. I had 6 months to find another position. I tried to defend myself, to explain what had happened, but the words came out wrong. I sounded desperate, paranoid even. I mentioned seeing my research under Diana's name, and Richard's expression changed from uncomfortable to cold. He told me that making unfounded accusations against a senior partner was serious, that if I continued down that path, I'd find myself without a reference from the firm. He suggested I think very carefully about my next steps, about my future in law. The meeting lasted 10 minutes. When I walked out of his office, I knew my career at Morrison and Wells was over, and Diana had made sure it would be nearly impossible for me to find another position at a comparable firm. The next 6 months were a special kind of hell. I applied to every major firm in Chicago, but somehow word had gotten around that I'd had performance issues at Morrison and Wells, that I'd made inappropriate accusations against a mentor, that I wasn't a team player. Nobody said it directly, but I could read between the lines of the polite rejection letters. I expanded my search to smaller firms, to corporate legal departments, to government positions. Nothing. The legal community in Chicago was smaller than people thought, and Diana Hartwick was well connected. I started to understand that she hadn't just stolen my work. She'd systematically destroyed my reputation to make sure I could never challenge her theft. My mother noticed I'd stopped talking about work with excitement. She'd been so proud when I got the job at Morrison and Wells, had told everyone in the neighborhood that her daughter was a lawyer at a fancy downtown firm. Now I sat at her kitchen table, the same table where I'd studied for the bar exam, and tried to explain that sometimes hard work wasn't enough, that sometimes the system was rigged against people like us. She listened, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug, and then she said something I've never forgotten. "Mia, they can take your job, but they can't take what you know. You're still a lawyer. You still have your mind, your education, your integrity. Those things matter more than any firm name." I wanted to believe her, but integrity didn't pay my student loans. Integrity didn't erase the humiliation of that presentation. Integrity didn't give me back the career I'd worked so hard to build. I left Morrison and Wells on a Friday afternoon in March, carrying a box with my few personal belongings, and I felt like I was carrying my own coffin. I was 27 years old, $180,000 in debt, and I had no idea what I was going to do with my life. I ended up taking a job at the Cook County Public Defender's office. It wasn't what I'd planned. Public defense paid a fraction of what big law did. The hours were brutal in a different way. And the cases were heartbreaking. But they were hiring. They didn't care about my history with Morrison and Wells, and they needed people who actually wanted to fight for something beyond billable hours. My supervisor, a woman named Patricia Rodriguez who'd been a public defender for 20 years, looked at my resume and said, "Morrison and Wells, huh? That must have been soul-crushing. Welcome to work that actually matters." The first year was an adjustment. I went from representing pharmaceutical companies to representing people who couldn't afford lawyers, from arguing about corporate liability to fighting to keep teenagers out of adult prison. I worked out of a cramped office with flickering fluorescent lights, shared a desk with 2 other defenders, and made about a third of what I'd made at Morrison and Wells. But something strange happened. I started to remember why I'd wanted to be a lawyer in the first place. Not for the prestige or the money or the corner office, but because I'd grown up watching my mother navigate systems that weren't designed for people like her, watching her struggle with legal documents she couldn't understand, watching her accept unfair treatment because she didn't know she had rights. I was good at public defense, really good. I had the research skills from my big law training, but now I was using them to find precedents that could help my clients instead of corporations. I had the work ethic that came from growing up poor, from understanding that every case mattered because behind every case was a real person whose life hung in the balance. And I had something else, something I'd developed during those months of humiliation at Morrison and Wells. A burning need to prove that I was better than what Diana Hartwick had made me seem. I won cases I shouldn't have won. I got charges dropped, sentences reduced, wrongful convictions overturned. I built a reputation as the public defender who never gave up, who found angles nobody else saw, who fought like hell for clients everyone else had written off. Patricia Rodriguez started assigning me the difficult cases, the ones that seemed hopeless, because she knew I'd find something. Other defenders started asking me for research help, for strategic advice. Judges began to recognize me, to take my arguments seriously. Slowly, painfully, I rebuilt my confidence and my reputation. 5 years into public defense, I decided to apply for a judicial clerkship. It was a long shot. Clerkships for federal judges usually went to people from top law schools with prestigious firm experience, not public defenders from state schools. But there was an opening with Judge Michael Chen, a relatively new appointee to the Northern District of Illinois, who had a reputation for caring more about legal reasoning than pedigree. I applied, not expecting anything, and was shocked when I got an interview. Judge Chen told me later that my writing sample, a brief arguing for the suppression of evidence in a Fourth Amendment case, was the best legal analysis he'd seen in years. He hired me on the spot. The clerkship changed everything. Judge Chen was brilliant, demanding, and completely uninterested in law firm politics or social hierarchies. He cared about the law, about justice, about getting decisions right. He taught me to think like a judge, to see both sides of every argument, to put aside personal feelings and focus on legal principles. He also encouraged me to apply to become a magistrate judge when I finished my clerkship, said I had the temperament and the intellect for the bench. I laughed at first. Magistrate judges were appointed by district judges. They handled preliminary matters in federal cases, presided over misdemeanor trials, made recommendations on complex motions. They were real judges, with real power, and I was still just the girl from Pilsen who'd been fired from Morrison and Wells for incompetence. But Judge Chen was persistent, and he had influence. He talked to other judges, wrote recommendations, made calls. When a magistrate position opened up, he personally encouraged me to apply. I was 33 years old, which was young for a federal judicial position, but I had the experience, the skills, and the support. The selection committee interviewed me 3 times, reviewed my entire legal career, and finally, miraculously, offered me the position. I was sworn in as a United States Magistrate Judge for the Northern District of Illinois on a Tuesday morning in September, exactly 7 years after I'd left Morrison and Wells in disgrace. My mother came to the swearing-in ceremony, wearing the dress she'd bought for my law school graduation. She cried when I took the oath, and afterward, she held my face in her hands and said, "They tried to break you, Mija, but you wouldn't break." I thought about Diana Hartwick, about that conference room, about the career I'd lost. I thought about how I'd rebuilt myself from nothing, how I'd found a path that had nothing to do with big law or billable hours or impressing senior partners. I thought about how I was now a federal judge, with a lifetime appointment, with the power to make decisions that actually mattered. And I thought about how Diana Hartwick had no idea that the girl she'd destroyed had become someone who could never be destroyed again. The courtroom I was assigned was smaller than the district judge's courtrooms, but still impressive, with dark wood paneling and the seal of the federal judiciary on the wall behind the bench. I had my own chambers, my own staff, my own docket of cases. I presided over detention hearings, ruled on discovery disputes, handled Social Security appeals, and conducted settlement conferences. The work was challenging and meaningful, and I loved it. I was fair, thorough, and unafraid to make difficult decisions. Attorneys started requesting to have their cases assigned to me because they knew I'd actually read their briefs, understand their arguments, and give them a fair hearing. I'd been on the bench for 5 years when the Morrison and Wells case appeared on my docket. It was a Tuesday afternoon in October, and my clerk brought me the file for a preliminary injunction hearing scheduled for the next morning. The case was a complex commercial dispute between a biotech company and its former chief scientist, allegations of stolen trade secrets and breach of contract. The law firm representing the defendant was Morrison and Wells. I felt my stomach drop when I saw the name, but I told myself it was a big firm, hundreds of attorneys, no reason to think I'd encounter anyone I knew. I reviewed the briefs that evening, made my notes, prepared my questions. The legal issues were interesting, the arguments well-crafted on both sides. The next morning, I entered my courtroom at exactly 9 o'clock, as I always did. The bailiff called everyone to order, and I took my seat behind the bench, looking down at the attorneys assembled before me. The plaintiff's counsel was from a firm I didn't recognize, 3 lawyers in expensive suits shuffling papers and whispering to each other. I turned my attention to the defense table, to the Morrison and Wells team, and my breath caught in my throat. Standing there, looking up at me with an expression of absolute shock, was Diana Hartwick. She'd aged, obviously. She was 55 now, her dark hair shot through with gray that was probably strategically placed by an expensive stylist. She was still beautiful, still expensively dressed, still radiating that confidence that came from never having faced real consequences for anything she'd done. But there was something different in her face now. A hardness around her eyes, a tightness in her jaw. She was staring at me like she'd seen a ghost, and I supposed in a way she had. The last time she'd seen me, I'd been a humiliated 27-year-old associate carrying a box of belongings out of her firm. Now I was wearing judicial robes, sitting on a federal bench, holding the power to make decisions that would affect her case and her client. I watched the recognition dawn in her eyes, watched her face go pale, watched her hands grip the edge of the counsel table. She'd probably assumed I'd disappeared into obscurity, maybe left law entirely. Certainly never imagined I'd end up in a position of authority over her. The other attorneys at her table were looking at her curiously, wondering why their lead counsel had frozen in place. I took a breath, centered myself the way Judge Chen had taught me, and spoke in the calm, professional voice I'd cultivated over 5 years on the bench. Good morning, Council. I'm Magistrate Judge Emma Torres. Before we begin, I need to address a potential conflict of interest. I looked directly at Diana, saw her eyes widen slightly. Ms. Hartwick, you and I worked together briefly at Morrison & Wells, approximately 12 years ago. I want to make sure all parties are aware of this prior professional relationship and give you the opportunity to request that this matter be reassigned to a different magistrate judge if you believe my impartiality might reasonably be questioned. The courtroom was completely silent. Diana's co-counsel were staring at her, waiting for her to respond. The plaintiff's attorneys were leaning forward, suddenly interested in this unexpected development. Diana opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. I could see her mind working, trying to figure out the best strategic move. If she requested reassignment, she'd have to explain why. And what could she say? That she'd sabotaged my career 12 years ago and was worried I might hold a grudge? That she'd stolen my work and gotten me fired and now feared I'd be biased against her? She couldn't say any of that without admitting what she'd done, and Diana Hartwick had spent 12 years building her reputation on work that included my stolen research. "No, Your Honor," she finally said, her voice slightly strained but professionally composed. "I don't believe reassignment is necessary. Our prior working relationship was brief and professional. I have no concerns about your impartiality." I nodded, made a note in the file. "Very well. Let the record reflect that the potential conflict has been disclosed and that defense counsel has waived any objection. We'll proceed with the preliminary injunction hearing. Ms. Hartwick, you may present your argument." I watched her gather herself, saw her pull on that armor of confidence she'd always worn. She launched into her argument, and I had to admit she was still a skilled advocate. She knew the law. She knew the facts. She presented her case clearly and persuasively. But I also noticed things I'd never noticed before, back when I was too junior and too intimidated to really see her clearly. She was aggressive to the point of being dismissive with opposing counsel. She made assertions that weren't quite supported by the evidence. She had a way of talking over people, of acting like her interpretation of the law was the only reasonable one. She was, I realized, a bully who'd learned to disguise bullying as confidence. The hearing lasted 3 hours. I asked pointed questions of both sides, requested clarification on legal standards, probed the factual allegations. Diana handled my questions competently, but I could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she kept glancing at me like she was waiting for some sign of personal animosity. I gave her none. I was scrupulously fair, equally challenging to both sides, focused entirely on the legal merits. This wasn't about revenge or vindication. This was about doing my job with integrity, which was something Diana had never understood. When the hearing concluded, I thanked the attorneys and told them I'd issue a written decision within 2 weeks. Everyone began packing up their materials. Diana was moving slowly, like she was trying to decide whether to approach the bench, whether to say something to me privately. I didn't give her the chance. I stood, left the bench, and returned to my chambers, where my clerk was already pulling up case law for the decision I needed to write. Over the next week, I immersed myself in the legal analysis. The case was genuinely close, the kind where reasonable judges could disagree about the outcome. The plaintiff had shown some likelihood of success on the merits, but the balance of harms wasn't entirely clear. The trade secret allegations were serious, but the defendant had legitimate arguments about independent development. I read every case cited by both sides, researched additional precedents, considered every angle. I wrote and rewrote my analysis, making sure every conclusion was supported by law and evidence, making sure nothing in my decision could be attributed to personal bias. In the end, I ruled partially in favor of the plaintiff. I granted a limited preliminary injunction preventing the defendant from using certain specific processes that clearly derived from the plaintiff's proprietary methods. But I denied the broader injunction the plaintiff had requested because they hadn't met their burden of showing irreparable harm for all the alleged trade secrets. It was a measured, careful decision that gave something to both sides, the kind of ruling that demonstrated judicial restraint and thorough legal reasoning. I issued the decision on a Wednesday afternoon, exactly 2 weeks after the hearing. My clerk told me later that the decision had gotten attention in the legal community, that people were impressed by the depth of analysis and the balanced approach. Several attorneys called my chambers to say it was a model of clear legal writing. The plaintiff's counsel filed a notice of appeal to the district judge, which was their right, but even their appellate brief acknowledged that my decision was well-reasoned, even if they disagreed with parts of it. Morrison and Wells filed a response brief that was professional and respectful, though Diana Hartwick's name wasn't on it. She'd apparently handed the case off to another partner for the appellate work. I thought that would be the end of it, that Diana and I would go back to our separate professional lives and never cross paths again. But 3 weeks after I issued my decision, my clerk told me that Diana Hartwick had requested a meeting in chambers. She wanted to speak with me privately, off the record, about a personal matter. My first instinct was to refuse. I had no desire to have a personal conversation with the woman who'd destroyed my career. But I was also curious about what she could possibly want to say to me after all these years. And I'd learned from Judge Chen that sometimes the most uncomfortable conversations were the most necessary ones. I agreed to meet with her on a Friday afternoon, after my last hearing of the day. My clerk showed her into my chambers at 4:30. Diana looked different than she had in the courtroom, less armored somehow. She was wearing a suit that probably cost $3,000, but her face looked tired, older than her 55 years. She sat in the chair across from my desk, and for a long moment, neither of us spoke. I waited, letting her be the one to break the silence, letting her be the one who had to find the words. "Thank you for seeing me, Your Honor," she finally said, and I noticed she couldn't quite meet my eyes. "I know you had no obligation to agree to this meeting." I nodded but didn't say anything. She took a breath, and I saw her hands were shaking slightly. "I've thought about what to say to you for the past 3 weeks, ever since I walked into your courtroom and saw you on the bench. I've thought about it for 12 years, if I'm being honest. And I still don't know how to say this, but I need to try." She looked up at me then, and I saw something in her face I'd never seen before. Genuine shame. "I sabotaged you at Morrison and Wells. I stole your research on the Donovan case, filed it under my name, rearranged your presentation materials so you'd look incompetent, and then I made sure you couldn't find another job at a major firm. I destroyed your career because I was threatened by how good you were, because I saw in you everything I'd had to sacrifice to make partner, and I couldn't stand the idea that you might succeed where I'd had to compromise so much." The words hung in the air between us. I'd known all of this, of course. I'd known it for 12 years. But hearing her actually admit it, hearing her say it out loud, was different than I'd expected. I felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. Anger and something almost like pity. "Why are you telling me this now?" I asked, my voice steady despite the emotions churning inside me. "Why not 12 years ago, or 5 years ago, or any time before you ended up in my courtroom?" Diana laughed, but it was a bitter sound without any humor in it. "Because I'm a coward, Your Honor. Because I spent 12 years telling myself I'd done what I had to do to survive in a system that's brutal to women, especially women who don't come from money or connections. Because I convinced myself that you'd be fine, that you'd land on your feet, that what I did wasn't really that bad. And then I walked into your courtroom and saw what you'd become despite what I did to you. And I realized I'd been lying to myself for 12 years. She leaned forward, her eyes finally meeting mine directly. "You became a federal judge. You did it without the Morrison and Wells name, without the big firm connections, without any of the advantages I thought were essential. You did it through actual merit, through being genuinely good at law, through integrity and hard work. And when you had the chance to punish me, when you had every reason to be biased against my client, you issued a decision that was so fair, so thoroughly researched, so professionally impeccable that even our appellate team couldn't find anything to criticize except the outcome. You were the judge I should have been if I hadn't sold my soul to make partner. I sat back in my chair, processing what she was saying. Part of me wanted to unleash 12 years of anger, to tell her exactly what her sabotage had cost me, the months of unemployment, the crushing self-doubt, the nights I'd cried myself to sleep wondering if I was really as incompetent as she'd made me seem. But another part of me, the part that had grown and changed over those 12 years, recognized that Diana's admission wasn't really about me. It was about her own reckoning with the choices she'd made, about her need for absolution that I wasn't sure I could or should give. "What do you want from me, Diana?" I asked quietly. "An absolution I don't have the power to give? A statement that what you did was okay because the legal profession is hard on women? Permission to feel better about yourself?" She shook her head, and I saw tears in her eyes, which shocked me more than anything else she'd said. Diana Hartwick didn't cry. Diana Hartwick was made of steel and ambition, and perfectly applied makeup that never ran. "I don't want anything from you," she said, her voice breaking slightly. "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know an apology 12 years too late doesn't fix what I did. I just needed you to know that I see it now, what I did to you, what I became. I needed you to know that you were right to leave Morrison and Wells, that you were right to build a career based on something other than billable hours, and client development and playing politics. I needed you to know that I've watched my career, my marriage, my relationships with my children all suffer because I prioritized the wrong things, because I became the kind of person who could sabotage a young woman's career and sleep fine at night." She stood up, smoothed down her expensive suit, and I saw her trying to pull herself back together. "I won't take up any more of your time, Your Honor. I just wanted to say what I should have said 12 years ago. I'm sorry. I'm sorry for what I did to you, and I'm sorry I didn't have the courage to admit it until I was standing in your courtroom, forced to confront the fact that you succeeded despite me, not because of anything I ever did for you." She turned to leave, and I found myself speaking before I'd really decided what I wanted to say. "Diana, wait." She stopped, turned back to me. I stood up, came around my desk, and for the first time in 12 years, we stood face to face as equals, not as senior partner and junior associate, not as judge and attorney, but as two women who'd both paid different prices for their choices in a profession that demanded too much from everyone. "I'm not going to tell you that what you did was okay," I said carefully. "It wasn't okay. You damaged my career, my confidence, and my faith in the legal profession. You made me doubt myself in ways that took years to overcome. But I'm also not going to pretend that what happened to me was the worst thing that could have happened. Losing that job at Morrison and Wells forced me to find a different path, one that actually aligned with my values. It made me a better lawyer and a better person. So I can't give you absolution, but I can tell you that I've moved past what you did, and I hope you can find a way to move past it too." Diana nodded, wiping at her eyes with the back of her hand in a gesture that was strangely vulnerable. "You're a better person than I am, Emma. You always were. I just wish I'd been smart enough to see it back then. To mentor you the way I should have instead of seeing you as a threat." She paused at the door, looked back one more time. "For what it's worth, your mother was right. They tried to break you, but you wouldn't break. And now you're exactly where you're supposed to be." After she left, I sat in my chambers for a long time, watching the sun set over the city through my window. I thought about that 26-year-old version of myself, standing in that conference room at Morrison and Wells, watching her career implode and having no idea how to fix it. I thought about the years of struggle that followed, the humiliation and the doubt and the slow, painful process of rebuilding. I thought about how I'd ended up here, in these chambers, wearing these robes, with the power to make decisions that actually mattered to people's lives. The truth was, Diana's sabotage had hurt me terribly at the time, but it had also freed me. If I'd stayed at Morrison and Wells, if I'd made partner, if I'd followed the path I'd originally planned, I would have spent my career representing corporations, and billing hours, and measuring my worth in annual bonuses. I never would have become a public defender. I never would have learned what it meant to fight for people who couldn't fight for themselves. I never would have caught Judge Chen's attention or earned this position on the bench. Diana had tried to destroy me, but in destroying the career I thought I wanted, she'd accidentally pushed me toward the career I actually needed. I didn't forgive Diana, not entirely. What she'd done was still wrong, still cruel, still a betrayal of everything mentorship should be. But I also didn't hate her anymore. I felt something closer to pity, understanding that she'd sacrificed her integrity for success and found the success hollow. She'd made partner, made millions, built a reputation, and somewhere along the way, she'd lost whatever had made her want to be a lawyer in the first place. I'd lost a job, but she'd lost something more fundamental. She'd lost herself. The following Monday, I got a letter from Diana. It was handwritten, not typed on firm letterhead, and it was addressed to me personally, not to Magistrate Judge Torres. In it, she told me more about what had happened after I left Morrison and Wells. She'd used my research to win the Brennan case, which had made her reputation and her fortune. She'd made partner at Morrison and Wells, then moved to a bigger firm for more money, then started her own boutique litigation practice. She'd married a fellow attorney, had 2 children, and divorced after 15 years when her husband told her she cared more about winning cases than about their family. Her children were adults now, and they barely spoke to her. Her daughter had recently told her that she'd decided not to go to law school because she didn't want to become like her mother. That comment, Diana wrote, had shattered something inside her. She'd spent months in therapy, trying to understand how she'd become someone her own daughter didn't want to emulate. She'd started examining all the choices she'd made, all the people she'd hurt, all the corners she'd cut in pursuit of success that felt increasingly meaningless. And then she'd walked into my courtroom and seen the person I'd become. And she'd realized that I'd found what she'd been searching for all along. A career that mattered, a sense of purpose, integrity that didn't have a price tag. She ended the letter by saying she was stepping back from active litigation, planning to do more pro bono work, trying to find a way to use her skills for something other than maximizing billable hours. She didn't ask me to write back. She just said she wanted me to know that seeing me on that bench had changed something in her, had made her want to be better than she'd been. She signed it simply Diana, not Diana Hartwick, Esquire, or any of the titles she'd accumulated over the years. I kept that letter in my desk drawer, and sometimes, on difficult days when I was struggling with a particularly hard decision or feeling overwhelmed by my caseload, I'd take it out and read it. Not because I needed her apology or her validation, but because it reminded me of something important, that the choices we make about who we want to be matter more than the positions we achieve, or the money we make, or the titles we accumulate. Diana had everything I'd once thought I wanted: the partnership, the reputation, the financial success, and she'd been miserable. I had a fraction of her income, a fraction of her professional prestige in the big law world, and I woke up every morning grateful for my work. Over the next few years, I heard occasional updates about Diana through the legal grapevine. She'd closed her boutique practice and taken a position at a legal aid clinic, using her litigation skills to help low-income clients fight evictions and consumer fraud. She'd started teaching trial advocacy at a local law school, mentoring young lawyers the way she should have mentored me. She'd written an article for a bar journal about the toxic aspects of big law culture and the importance of defining success on your own terms. People said she'd changed, that she was different, that she seemed happier despite making a fraction of what she used to make. I never reached out to her, and she never contacted me again beyond that one letter. We'd said what needed to be said, and anything more would have been unnecessary. But I thought about her sometimes, about the parallel paths our lives had taken, about how we'd both ended up in places we never expected. She'd climbed to the top of the big law mountain and found it empty. I'd been pushed off that mountain and found solid ground elsewhere. In the end, we'd both learned the same lesson, just in very different ways. That integrity matters more than success, that character matters more than reputation, and that the only career worth having is one that lets you sleep at night. 5 years after Diana walked into my courtroom, I was nominated for a district judgeship. It was unexpected. District judgeships were rare, prestigious, and usually went to magistrate judges with longer tenure than mine. But I'd built a reputation for thorough legal analysis, fair decisions, and absolute integrity. Attorneys on both sides of cases respected me. Other judges valued my opinions. And I had the support of Judge Chen, who'd become Chief Judge of the Northern District, and who wrote a recommendation letter that apparently carried significant weight with the Judicial Selection Committee. The confirmation process was rigorous. Background checks, interviews, review of every decision I'd ever written, testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee. They asked about my time at Morrison & Wells, about why I'd left, about the gap in my resume between big law and public defense. I told them the truth, that I'd lost a position due to what I now understood was a toxic work environment, that I'd struggled to find another job, that I'd rebuilt my career in public service because that's where I found meaning. I didn't mention Diana by name. I didn't need to. The story of a young lawyer pushed out of big law, and finding success elsewhere was common enough that nobody questioned it. I was confirmed as a United States District Judge for the Northern District of Illinois on a Thursday afternoon in June. My mother was there for the investiture ceremony, sitting in the front row, crying tears of pride. Patricia Rodriguez from the Public Defender's Office was there. Judge Chen was there, beaming like a proud parent. And in the back row, sitting quietly and unobtrusively, was Diana Hartwick. She didn't approach me after the ceremony. She didn't try to speak to me or congratulate me. She just sat there, watching, and when our eyes met across the courtroom, she nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement and respect. And then she left. My clerk told me later that Diana had sent a card to Chambers, just a simple congratulations card with a handwritten note inside. "You earned this through merit and integrity," she'd written. "The judiciary is better for having you, and I'm better for having known you, even though I didn't deserve to. Congratulations. Judge Torres." I filed the card away with her letter, 2 pieces of evidence that people could change, that redemption was possible, that even the worst betrayals could eventually lead to understanding, if not quite forgiveness. As a district judge, my cases became more complex, my decisions more consequential. I presided over criminal trials, civil litigation, constitutional challenges. I wrote opinions that became precedent, that other judges cited, that shaped the law in small but meaningful ways. I worked harder than I'd ever worked, but it was work that mattered, work that made a difference, work that let me sleep at night knowing I'd done my best to be fair and just and thorough. And sometimes, late at night in my chambers, working on a particularly difficult opinion, I'd think about that conference room at Morrison & Wells, about the 26-year-old girl who'd watched her career implode and had no idea what would come next. I'd think about how devastated she'd been, how certain that her life was over, how convinced that Diana Hartwick had destroyed everything that mattered. And I'd wish I could go back and tell her that it was all going to be okay, that the destruction was actually liberation, that losing that job was the best thing that could have happened to her, that she was going to end up exactly where she was supposed to be. But I couldn't go back, and that girl couldn't have believed me anyway. She had to live through the struggle, through the doubt, through the slow process of rebuilding. She had to learn that success wasn't about impressing senior partners or making partner or billing hours. She had to learn that integrity mattered more than reputation, that character mattered more than credentials, that the only career worth having was one that aligned with your values. She had to learn all of that the hard way, through pain and humiliation and years of hard work, because that's the only way those lessons really stick. Diana Hartwick tried to destroy me, and in a way, she succeeded. She destroyed the version of me that thought success meant working at Morrison & Wells, that thought making partner was the ultimate goal, that thought prestige and money were what mattered most. She destroyed that version of me, and in doing so, she accidentally created space for the person I actually needed to become. She pushed me off the path I thought I wanted, and onto the path I actually needed. She meant it as cruelty, but it became the greatest gift anyone ever gave me, even if neither of us understood that at the time. I've been a district judge for 7 years now. I have a reputation for fairness, thorough legal analysis, and decisions that are well-reasoned even when they're difficult. Attorneys respect me. Other judges value my opinions. Law students study my decisions in their classes. I've mentored young lawyers, particularly women from backgrounds like mine, and I've tried to be the mentor Diana should have been to me. I've used my position to make the legal system a little more just, a little more accessible, a little more fair to people who don't have money or connections or prestigious degrees. My mother passed away 2 years ago, and at her funeral, person after person came up to me to tell me how proud she'd been of me. How she'd told everyone about her daughter, the federal judge, how she'd said I was proof that integrity and hard work mattered more than anything else. I thought about all the sacrifices she'd made so I could go to law school, all the nights she'd worked cleaning offices so I could study instead of working full-time, all the times she'd believed in me even when I didn't believe in myself. I thought about how she'd been right all along, that they could take my job but they couldn't take what I knew, that I was still a lawyer, that I still had my mind and my education and my integrity. I still see Diana occasionally at legal conferences or bar events. We're cordial, professional, but we don't seek each other out. We've both moved on, both built lives that reflect different values than the ones that drove us at Morrison & Wells. She's still doing legal aid work, still teaching, still trying to make amends for the person she used to be. I'm still on the bench, still writing decisions, still trying to make the legal system work better for everyone who comes before me. We're both exactly where we need to be, even if we took very different paths to get here. Sometimes young lawyers come to my chambers for advice, asking how to handle toxic work environments, how to deal with senior attorneys who sabotage them, how to rebuild after professional setbacks. I tell them my story, not all of it, but enough. I tell them that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the best thing that ever happened to you, if you're willing to learn from it and grow through it. I tell them that integrity matters more than any job, that character matters more than any career, that the only success worth having is success that lets you look at yourself in the mirror and like the person you see. And I tell them what my mother told me, sitting at that kitchen table all those years ago when I thought my life was over. They can take your job, but they can't take what you know. You're still a lawyer. You still have your mind, your education, your integrity. Those things matter more than any firm name, any partnership, any salary. Those things are what make you who you are, and nobody can take them away unless you let them. What an incredible journey Emma took from that devastating conference room at Morrison & Wells to the federal bench, from humiliation and career destruction to a position of real authority and meaningful impact. Her story reminds us that integrity, character, and staying true to your values matter more than any job title or salary, and that sometimes the worst betrayals push us toward the lives we're actually meant to live. What would you have done in Emma's situation? Would you have fought harder against Diana's sabotage? Or would you have, like Emma, found a different path entirely? Have you ever experienced a professional betrayal that, looking back, actually redirected you towards something better? Share your story in the comments below. If this story touched your heart and reminded you that true success comes from integrity, not prestige, and that character matters more than credentials, please show your support by hitting that like button. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and click the notification bell so you never miss our inspiring stories about real people whose courage and integrity changed their lives. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.